Okay. Couple things. Just I always forget to make these announcements until I'm halfway up to my office. So I brought like the huge poster with me this time. So just again, want to make you aware that we have a conference here, Stand Firm Conference. We do every year. This year it's going to be Nancy Piercy as one of our keynotes, and she's really actually quite famous in the world of apologetics and kind of beyond, certainly beyond. Her most recent book is doing a lot on like talking about the body and gender issues and sexuality and things like that. Really articulate voice, and she's definitely is a really great grab for us to get her as a speaker. And so a few of us other jokers are speaking also. So what I'll extend to you guys, since it's on campus and we need people to come, is a three percentage points extra credit. And I really don't do extra credit typically except for this. So if you come, I'll have to have you do a little bit of something to sort of make it worth it. But if you do a write-up for each of the sessions you go to, and if you go to each session, you get 3 percentage points for the course if you go, because it's definitely a nice sort of augment to the things that we're doing, yeah.
What are the times?
So it's Friday evening. There'll be 2 sessions. And then Saturday, it'll kick off, I want to say around 8:30, something like that. Goes through the day, through the like mid to late afternoon. We're done certainly by dinner. Lunch is provided. So right now, I should know how much it costs. I think it's $20 for students. So it's really, really very affordable for a conference. It's going to jump up, I want to say March 2nd. I think it jumps up to this one is happening on March 23rd, 24th. So it's the weekend after spring break. So we have spring break, we come back for a week of school, and then it's that weekend. But yeah, lots of different sessions. It'll be a good time. Check it out. There might be, if you absolutely can't make that, let me know, and if you want to do something else in lieu of that. But we'd love to get. This has always been the odd thing to me, at least, is we put on these events. Last year we had a big debate we had a sort of famous atheist come and had a debate on campus, and got some people, but not as many people as I thought. I thought we'd be turning people away practically, but it's hard to get you guys out to a conference. It's hard to get Southwestern students out to conferences, to our own events, which means that we don't put on as many events and that sort of thing. So I know everybody's tight on the budget and all this stuff. I totally get it. There's only so much you can do. So, but in any case, if I can incentivize it with the course points, then I'm happy to do that to sort of get more of our students out. But we hope to do another debate next year. Because that was a good time. Anybody go to the debate last year by chance? Michael Shermer? Let's see. It's a good time. You missed it. No, it's on video, so if you want to catch that. But again, okay, the other thing I want to mention, again, is this Hawaii trip over spring break. I don't know if it's going to fit everybody's schedule or not, or whatever, but you can get credit for, like, tuition credit for a course for going. It would probably be an elective for you unless you are concentrating in apologetics or philosophy, perhaps. But you can the course tuition is radically discounted to $125. So if you take that plus your flight and some expenses, you probably pay more than you would pay for the course, but you're getting it in Hawaii. Okay, and it's only a week long. So if you want to hear more about those details, let me know. The course will zero in on sort of the reliability and authenticity of Scripture. It's going to be a really good time, and you get to hear J. Warner Wallace, who's going to be our keynote speaker at our conference. I don't know if you know that name or not, but he's a big-time speaker. Does the kind of cold case Christianity stuff. That he's a former detective, and I'll mention him later in the course, but he's going to be one of our speakers, and he'll be just hanging out because he loves hanging out with students, especially with students. So, all right. Any questions or anything on any of that? All right. Any questions on the religious pluralism? I'm sorry I didn't take much time for questions, but any questions on any of that? Simple versus sophisticated religious pluralism. way in which inclusivity is impossible, I want to say that all claims are exclusive, are sort of equally exclusive. All claims are, there are no claims that are arrogant or intolerant. Right? There's just claims. And you could be kind of a jerk about it as you make claims, or arrogant about it as you make claims. That's the attitude one brings to, the presentation of a claim. That's not the claim itself. All right, well, let's push on then. What did I do? We did that, didn't we? Yeah, we did that. All right, postmodernism then. And it's one of these words that people toss around. It's used in lots of different ways. Occasionally, not occasionally. Well, yeah, it's occasionally, I suppose. People in churches will be very favorable to this term, right? Some churches will even say, hey, we're a postmodern church. Now, I always want to say, okay, well, what do you mean by that? What does that mean to be a postmodern church? Sometimes all that means is that instead of like pews, certainly those are out, but even like chairs are out. They've gone to the local thrift store, bought out all their old, sort of beat up couches and arranged it in like a circle rather than the traditional sort of auditorium style. Stage might be in the middle, who knows, right? Or the guy's hanging from the raft, who knows, right? All kinds of different things, right? And they're postmodern. Well, that's not what we're talking about, right? That, to some degree, I mean, I think there's good discussions to be had about how to do church and how to do your sanctuary and how to do these sorts of things. But I don't much care about that stuff, not nearly as much as I do this philosophical view that we're going to talk about that falls under the label of postmodernism, right? When one is a postmodern about truth, that's where I certainly care the most. If a church wants to do a little different, I mean, that's nothing new. I mean, that's something we've been sort of reinventing kind of the methodologies of our church services for a long, long time. The cutting edge, these days the cutting edge sort of changes so very quickly that things seem outdated pretty quickly. I mean, it used to be to get rid of the pews. That was major, you're liberal. No, or something, right? If you don't have pews in the building. So I'm not so concerned about that, even though that's an interesting and good discussion to have, especially if you're, on staff at a church. What I'm concerned about is someone who defines this in the philosophical sense. Now, it's a large task just to try to nail down a definition, and I think in part it's a fruitless sort of thing. It's an impossible sort of thing because of the way in which the view is defined. Now, some people occasionally will say, no, you can define this. Let's define it as anybody who is post the modern era. Post means after, right? So if you come after the modern era, which in philosophy that means Descartes to Kant, basically. So it's sort of 17th, 18th centuries. It's a little weird to call that the modern period, but that's in philosophy what is. Today would be called the contemporary period. And Descartes to Kant is the modern period in philosophy. That's not a very good way to define it, right? Because that would mean that all of us are postmodern. All of us are postmodernists. And that's certainly not helping very much since, of course, that's true that we are post the modern era, but that's not really picking out any particular view. Occasionally, people go a bit further and say, well, okay, it's a rejection of modernism. It's a rejection of the Enlightenment thinking. It's a rejection of Descartes and sort of folks that came after him. Well, the problem here is that there's no sort of single view in the modern period. In fact, it's one of my favorite periods of philosophy, in part because there's such a great diversity of views. You've got Descartes, who's pretty optimistic about knowledge, though he's got these really strict conditions for knowledge. And then you've got others like Hume and Kant, perhaps, who are not so optimistic, right? It's actually, they're more postmodern than many postmodernists these days, especially a guy like Kant. So you really can't nail down the modern thinking to one view. Again, there's as much diversity as I think there is that we see today. There were, though, few that were a bit optimistic, the sort of so-called Enlightenment thinkers who are pretty optimistic about the sorts of and kinds of knowledge we can have. Right? So Descartes famously, in his project at least, requires certainty. He's not going to believe anything unless he believes it with certainty, he says. And he thinks he kind of builds back, everything that we take ourselves to know, but now with certainty. He thinks he delivers certainty. Most people think he did, so he's going to have us doubt everything we could possibly doubt, sort of destroy. This is project, this is meditations. He wants to destroy with doubt all of our beliefs and then build them back with certainty. Well, most people think he did the first part quite well. Destroyed them all. Not so much on the second part of building them back, so that we sort of have this radical skepticism that results. Why? Because it seems that we can't truly be certain about most of the things that we believe. We've talked about this a little bit. Again, we don't mean by certainty very confident. What we mean by certainty is it's literally impossible to doubt its truth. Right? So can I doubt that there's a chair right here? Yeah, right? Because there could be a hologram machine in the ceiling, or I could be hallucinating, or I could be in the Matrix, if that's the example I could use. Right? Or as Descartes had it, we could be deceived by an evil demon to believe that there's a chair there when there's not really. That just seems possible. He didn't think we were, and most of these guys don't think we actually are hallucinating, that there is a hologram machine in the ceiling. That's not the point. The point is that it's merely possible, and if it's merely possible, then by definition, we don't have certainty about that thing. Right? Do I have certainty that you guys exist? No. You could be robots, for all I know. I could be dreaming this. I could be hallucinating you. It's really odd, but it's possible. That's the point. So when we start to think about what are the things about which we can doubt, it's almost everything. It's almost everything. There's very few things that we actually have Descartes' version of certainty about. Right? So that's the sort of worry, is that these guys thought we could have certainty about all of what we know, and it turns out not so much. And so it's a rejection of that sort of striving for and search for certainty. Okay. Again, doesn't really give us a definition of the view, but it's at least a rejection of that. So when someone does try to flesh out what postmodernism is, it seems to roughly track something like this. There is no such thing as reality where we know that reality in an objective way. What we have are realities. You have your reality, I have my reality. We don't have reality as it is in itself. We have only reality as experienced. That makes sense to you? We don't have reality that we just know in this objective, almost third-person sort of way. All that we have any kind of awareness of or any knowledge of is the way reality appears to us. The way reality is as experienced only in the first person. So your reality, this concedes that your reality may be very, very different from mine. Right? You have a very different perspective, presumably, than I do. Right? You sort of filter, just as I do, all of the experiences of reality through your background. Right? These things will shape the world as experienced to make it different, presumably, than my experience. So you didn't have my background, you don't have my personality, you don't have my beliefs, my worldview. So you, I would presume, very likely see the world very differently. But the point is that that's all there is. That's all that we ever do, in fact, know is this sort of perspective on reality, sometimes called a perspectival view of truth. Okay, so this is a form of relativism, though a lot of postmodern thinkers don't like to fall under that category, but it's, just as a straightforward matter, just the way we define relativism. It's a version of relativism, admittedly more sophisticated in some ways. There's a just like the simplistic version of religious pluralism, there's a simplistic version of relativism that just says, hey, there's no absolute truth. Okay, well, that's self-refuted. Okay. But the postmodern takes a bit more of a sophisticated look at this. They would say what truth is relative to, catch this, is one's linguistic community. It's often grounded in the way in which we use our language. And they don't mean just, are you an English speaker, or are you a Spanish speaker, or are you, do you speak Korean or whatever? They mean the kind of concepts and constructs that we have, that we express in language, that's really stands between us and the way reality is. We sort of see reality through the concepts and language that we have, the language that we have embraced in our lives. Okay? This is sometimes called the linguistic turn, where thinkers and philosophers begin to make truth grounded in language rather than the way the world is. Rather than the facts of the world, it's in a way grounded just in the language we use. So it's sort of like, is what you're saying true? I don't know. Does it correspond or sort of match up with the way in which you're using your language in your language community? So Christians have definitely would be considered a kind of linguistic community, and really not Christians. It'd probably be like Baptist American, white, probably mostly Christians, because think about how there's a way in which we kind of see a lot of the same issues in the same way, almost automatically, almost knee-jerk. You see what I mean? Whereas somebody that's coming from a very different context kind of can't believe some of the things we believe. Things like, just examples that I've heard people mention are things like capital punishment, right? In places in Europe, the conservative Christians oftentimes will think capital punishment is a moral wrong. When you come here to the U.S., especially Texas, probably, right, sort of white evangelical America, and it's like an obvious thing we have to have in our country. Or gun control from places like Europe, Australia. They just think it's obvious that you shouldn't arm the citizenry. It's just obvious. Why? Well, that's their perspective. That's their sort of worldview. That's their linguistic community in that sort of sense. It's the way in which they talk about the world. But those of us that have been raised, say, in this world, this part of the world, right? So that's why, it's always a bit hard to go countercultural. And some of you guys that are international students, have experienced this, where there's sort of like, there's certain sort of ways in which people talk, things that people assume, concepts that they wield, that they talk about and express in language, that you find unusual, to say the least, right? If not obviously false. It's the way in which when you go, if you were to like talk to a racist, or if we could travel in time and talk to like a slave owner, for example, there would be these sort of assumptions and just the way in which they talk about the world that are radically different from the way in which you think about the world. You know what I mean? That marks out different linguistic communities. Questions about that? Yeah. So this would be kind of postmodern era. Now, so kind of, yeah, but Kant, you get into Nietzsche. Nietzsche's a sort of father figure, so to speak, of this postmodern linguistic turn. guys like Wittgenstein and who else? Yeah, that's right. That's right. The emphasis, and there's a lot of ways in which one's philosophy of language. So philosophy of language becomes a discipline in its own right. And those that sort of see that language, it sort of all turns on language, really sort of that's the linguistic turn, obviously. And that's the sort of like the postmodern sort of stream of thought. There's others that definitely think about philosophy of language and things like that, like a guy like Bertrand Russell, that wouldn't typically be thought of as a postmodern, though he's thinking about language. And there's lots of these guys, Tarski and others, who are doing a lot with language and truth, but they're not necessarily going that postmodern route. Yeah. The sort of slogan that people look to as some people say, look, there really is no definition of postmodernism, but Lyotard's slogan, because that's really all it is about as good as you get, to just claim that there are no meta narratives. Notice the narrative part, so this sort of linguistic part. It's saying that there are no narratives that sort of govern them all. There are only what are referred to as micro narratives, and that would be your narrative for understanding the world, my narrative for understanding the world, and then we can sort of extend out to other sort of shared micro narratives, people who share micro narrative. So maybe like there'd be a sort of micro narrative shared of Southwestern, sorts of folks, or Baptist folks, and probably again white America. Right, but there are no meta-narratives. That is to say, there are no narratives that sort of say, this is the objective truth, right? Which we would say, well, how do you, don't you think Scripture is a kind of meta-narrative? It's tricky for folks that want to be Christian, but also postmodern. And I started to say this earlier, but I have found more postmoderns in church than I have in the academy, than in university settings. In fact, I wanted to do my dissertation critiquing a postmodern view of truth at a certain point, or a certain early point in my PhD. And I was told, yeah, you're not going to get the professors to work with you on that because they just don't take it seriously. These are all atheists. This is at the University of Iowa. All atheists, agnostics, none of them are Christians. They're just philosophers, and there's no good argument for postmodernism, as we'll see. So you might be able to read some of the folks, but they wouldn't be reading like this sort of straightforward, full-fledged postmodern. So I couldn't do my dissertation on this area. They wouldn't even read them. They read a lot of people they disagree with, but they wouldn't even read this. So it doesn't find its home in what's sometimes called analytic philosophy, which is definitely the school of philosophy that most of us guys at Southwestern hold to. We do analytic philosophy. And I would say that's the dominant view of philosophy across our universities for the most part, versus a kind of continental approach to philosophy and things. But the so-called emergent church or emerging church, right? That's really the kind of lost steam, it seems like. I could be wrong. I mean, you guys might know better than me. Are people still saying emergent church, watch out for it, or hooray for the emergent? Have you guys heard of the emergent church? Okay, so maybe not even. When I was in grad school, so that would have been the early 2000s, this was all the rage. The various ones that were defending a kind of emerging church movement, and there was a big variety of people. Brian McLaren, I don't know if you know that name, or even a guy like Rob Bell was probably, like the early Rob Bell was probably more of the emergent church variety. And it was those that were literally taking postmodern thought and sort of co-opting it into the church, into thinking about how to do church and things like that. But there was great diversity, and there was actually, when I was in grad school at Biola University, they had a conference where they had a panel discussion. They had some of the main guys that were there. They didn't invite McLaren because he was kind of almost too big at that point. There's too many fanboys that would be. Anyway, they kind of didn't invite him, but they invited everybody else that was pretty big figures in the movement. And they asked this question: what if somebody came into your church and they were Buddhist and they wanted to worship the Buddha? Would that be okay? They wanted to set up a little shrine and do whatever the Buddhist does to the in worshiping. There was difference of opinion, which tells you where we're headed here. Some said no, that would be too much. We can allow for lots of diversity of how you worship God and so forth. But others on the panel that were Christian pastors said that would be completely fine. We in fact, we would try to accommodate that. We would try to give them a space for them to set up their shrine and worship how they want to worship, right? Because who are we to say their perspective on reality is wrong? Because truth is grounded in this perspective. So that was, again, the emerging church seems to not be emerging these days, but as much. But
Rob Bell went off the rails even further than
yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a way in which it sounds kind of interesting and sort of what's that? Well, there's that, but also it's like when something's new and different, it's sort of blowing your mind, and you're kind of, it can be kind of fun for a little bit. Then when you begin to sort of realize, oh wait, if that's true, then this follows or whatever. And I think there's actually been some good from this movement, even though I'm not an adherent at all. I'm in fact quite critical of the movement, but I think folks like my parents' generation, which my parents went through Bible college, my dad went to DTS, and so he's approaching his 70s now. So kind of that era, kind of the baby boomer era, I think there was this tendency to sort of say, here is how to understand doctrine A, here's how to understand doctrine B. Anything outside of that is not even worth thinking about, right? Whereas these days, I don't really hear that as much. I mean, you take the guys that are here that I have huge respect for, the theologians we have on faculty, and they will say, boy, these doctrines are really difficult, and we're still working on, we have got kind of the sketch of it. We certainly, have what we all believe in, but how to understand its sort of implications and its peculiarities, there's a lot of work to be done. And so I think, kind of, again, what would be my parents' generation, kind of the baby boomer generation, we're kind of handed these, sort of like, here's what you believe, and that's it. And so I think the emergent church movement really appealed to those folks. My parents got into it. They were reading Brian McLaren and thinking he was awesome, and watching Rob Bell's, what do they call his videos, the Pneuma videos or whatever. And they were all taken by all this stuff. But they've since kind of realized, thankfully, that there's issues here. Yep. I think fundamentally, now there might be differences of opinion on this issue, but I think fundamentally they are individual. But we can, in a way, share micro-narratives. So it's not like your micro-narrative can govern my micro-narrative. I've got mine, you've got yours, and that's kind of the end of the story. But insofar as they kind of overlap, kind of shared, we have a shared way of talking about the world, shared language and things. We sort of form for ourselves a community. We talk the same. But again, one of us is not right over the other, and there's not some almost mini meta-narrative that governs both of our views. Again, it all boils down to this sort of like individualistic perspective that we each have.
What? Then why, or what's the philosophical reasoning or argument for why, largely in society, the individual is being denied and the group identity is being embraced?
Today?
Yeah. It seems to run counter to postmodern thought.
Yeah. I don't know if it is really. Like sometimes these things are said to be this way, but I don't see it myself. Like I see us in some ways more individualistic than we've ever been. And that's really a product of the sort of the radical takeover of Western civilization. So you've got guys like Descartes who, right, it's the one bit of philosophy everybody knows, right? Descartes doubts everything there is to doubt except for one thing. He thinks, therefore he is, right? So everybody knows I think, therefore I am. Now notice how individualistic that is. He grounds the entire edifice of knowledge on the fact that he exists. Where and as I understand the sort of like major movements of, sort of thought through history prior to his time, it was more sort of communitarian and it was more kind of authoritarian. So being on the basis of scripture and these sorts of things, in the sort of scholastic times. Descartes brings us into the modern period by I think, therefore I am. And I just don't see that changing much in the West. I think there are in sort of some East, and I think that most people in the East are Western these days, Western in their thinking. So China, I don't know these issues well enough to really weigh in, but as I'm told, right, they're really grappling with capitalism, Marxism, and so on. And these are all Western ideas. So that the Eastern civilization is disappearing. It's really only in kind of rural areas, and maybe some carryovers in other places. But I don't know. You want to come back on any of that, or that sure answer your question? But I think people give lip service to that. We're getting to be more of a sort of group oriented, but it's still radically individualistic.
Which that happens from Marxism, cultural Marxism. Your value and your worth is dependent upon your group identity, not necessarily you as an individual. I think intellectually there's a hope now with intersectionality that we might get back to the individual, but I'm not sure that we'll carry that to the large. I think it's largely still fragmented into groups. My group's more oppressed than your group, or your group's oppressing my group. Mm-hmm. I don't know, maybe I'm thinking wrongly, or incorrectly, but looking at least the philosophical foundation that we have now, I just find it very interesting how there seems, at least from my perspective, almost a denial of value and worth individualistically.
Yeah. I think there's a sense in which that's right. So I think we might be sort of like zeroing in on two different bits of society here, or ways of sort of looking at society. I think what this is a claim about is philosophy, and in particular epistemology, right, of how we know the world. And group identity is definitely a big deal, and the individual in a way can get lost in that. But I guess as I talk to folks, yeah, there is an appeal to the group in which they identify. It's still sort of it's still this sort of individualistic appeal from an epistemology side of things. So where they get their values, probably the group, right, and that sort of a thing. But it's still in how they know these things and how they sort of know the world. Again, they'll appeal to the group, but it's done from this individualistic standpoint. I don't know if I'm doing a good job of describing that, but yeah, I don't. So now there might be like inconsistencies too, certainly. So there might be the case that a person would say identifies sort of postmodern, and then you realize you're just saying the things that your group says. I mean, you're functioning as if your group's beliefs carry with it a kind of meta-narrative. And so that's definitely possible too. But the consistent postmodern says there are no such things. There are only micro-narratives. There are only the ways in which we talk about the world, and we kind of organize ourselves with other people that talk about the world in similar ways. So there are groups. It's definitely a linguistic community, right? But it sort of boils down to this micro narrative, what your narrative, your perspective on the way the world is. Yeah.
Did you call social media platforms groups?
So like Facebook or something? Not a Facebook group. That's something different. And something real, but scary. No. Let's see. So I think you would maybe not, right? Not strictly speaking, though. There's ways in which, say, Facebook regulates things, and YouTube certainly regulates things, and so on. But there are certain like values that in the controls that are there. So for example, there are ways to get kicked off Twitter. You know what I mean? So, and who makes those value judgments? Well, somebody does. But whether or not it's wrong, like, I don't know exactly what gets you kicked off Twitter. Let's just say like really racist things. Actually, I wish that would probably get you kicked off, but I don't know if it does. Let's say that's what gets you kicked off. Well, notice saying really racist things is wrong is a value judgment. And to think that everybody should hold to that is to appeal to a meta-narrative, right? So only in that respect, I think, so sort of just in principle, I think social media platforms are at least sort of taken to be value-free, and a bunch of different people can get on Facebook and that sort of thing. And to a large, there's a lot of Christian stuff on Facebook, a lot of Christian stuff on Twitter and whatever else. Am I answering your question? Or do you mean, maybe you mean too that social media platforms tend to like create a little world of your own? Is that the kind of thing? Okay. Yeah, to some degree, wherein you can, in a way, live such that all your relationships are virtual, or mediated by this medium, or a particular medium, say Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever. So in a sense, at least lends towards people going further into themselves. You know what I mean? Because there's a way in which just sort of hanging out with people makes you aware of other views and other ideas. And what I'm going to really say presently here helps us to evaluate those things, to know whether or not our perspective is the right one. But a postmodern can't make sense of that. Right? There's not a right one or a wrong one, because that's to assume there's some sort of standard that's outside of our perspectives that we can appeal to or govern, that in a way governs our perspectives. The view is there is no such thing. Right? Which again is why I think I didn't quite get to saying this, is why it's so difficult to define postmodernism, because who says your view of postmodernism is right? That gives you a kind of meta-narrative that you're trying to force on all of us. Maybe your view of postmodernism is wrong. Maybe my view is right. Maybe yours is wrong. Maybe, yeah. Again, that's to give this sort of black and white saying hey, this is the way postmodernism is, so all of you should believe it, is to violate what it is to be a postmodern. At best, we can describe our perspective on these things and describe even the very definition of it.
I'm struggling to connect the dots.
Then you got it. You got postmodern. No.
Postmodern society who still relies heavily on science. Or science
Right.
method. So in my mind, those can't equal. One would need to take over the other. Either, science produces truth, or there is no.
Yeah.
Where are we headed? Is that kind of like the gender debate where science is one thing? But
Yeah. So in practice, it's easiest to be a postmodern about God, salvation, morality, philosophy, and so on. It's difficult to be a postmodern when it comes to bridges and buildings, and rocket ships or space shuttles and so on. I'm not sure I want to get onto a craft if the person who has designed it is postmodern. You know what I'm saying? Because if they're questioning the sort of deep, sort of engineering structures of the world, the way the world is, and this has happened. So there are buildings that were designed to have a sort of postmodern flair to them that have come crashing down because they weren't built with structural soundness. They weren't built assuming the world has certain facts about it that cannot be violated. So you've got these rooms that rather than being sort of like, square-ish or whatever, are in these really weird angles where the weight shifts in different ways, and they've come crashing down at times and been these huge failures. But again, to say the word failure seems to be something that runs contrary to their view, because that is to assume there is a way the world is. We have some sort of connection or awareness of it. And when we go against that way, then we're wrong. We've failed. Things will crash, right? The bridge will not hold us up. The space shuttle, the airplane, or whatever is going to not get in the air, or it's not going to be in the air for very long, right? But it seems hard to be a postmodern about science, given the fact that we've walked on the, man has walked on the moon. So, allegedly. Now, again, there are ways that a person could probably work out a view that makes sense of these things. I don't think this is completely just knock down, drag out, but I do think it sort of makes problem for the person that wants to say, yeah, it's just whatever, your perspective or whatever. It's like, no, it seems to be very easy for my perspective to be wrong, right? And that is for me to make a claim about the world, and the world isn't that way. Therefore, I'm wrong, no matter how I see it, no matter how I want it to be, or my perspective is. So I do think this is a problem, certainly. It's much easier to do it for things like morality, for things like God, and so on, and just say, hey, you've got your way of this, this sounds like the religious pluralists in some ways. You've got your way of experiencing God. Don't force that on me. I've got my way. I've got my perspective. And that perspective is, by definition, truth.
To bring back in the blind man and the elephant analogy, epistemologically, is it that everyone's touching a different part of the elephant, or that the elephant doesn't exist?
If we were to use that for the postmodern, it depends. Sorry, yeah. It's a good question, actually. It's probably that, for all we know, the elephant doesn't exist. Right? There is no narrator for a consistent, postmodern. There's no person saying, yeah, there's actually is an elephant there. We're just all blind and describing different parts of it. because there's no reason in principle for your experiences to be even consistent. Whereas the blind men, right, it is the second you know they're feeling different parts of the elephant, it's perfectly consistent, logically speaking. But that would not be, the thoroughgoing postmodern. It would be to say, hey, your perspective, your experience of the world can be radically different, logically incompatible with mine, and neither of those perspectives rule. Neither of those can be evaluated in light of the other. And there's no meta-narrative to look to evaluate. There's no standard beyond our experiences. So you can have completely inconsistent, logically speaking, views seen as perfectly legitimate ways of experiencing the world. Yeah. So with that example, they'd probably say, hey, we don't even know there's an elephant there.
Or I'm touching an elephant, you're touching a dog, and he's touching your eye.
Could be. But even so, the consistent person denies the narrator, I think. I think if I was to be a postmodern and I'm evaluating that story, I'm going to say the setup of it is already modernistic. It's modernistic in the sense that you have the narrator describing the elephant. So it's wild, right? This is like new frontier. This is like come up with whatever you want to in some ways. And it's going to be seen as sort of cutting edge and whatever. There's a hilarious, not so much for them, but thing that happened where, because they use all these words, there's these sort of common words that a lot of these guys talk about. And I was reading, there was a guy that I was reading that somebody close to me suggested, John Caputo. His name, I don't know if you know that name, but like I could not get past the first couple pages. I had no idea what he's talking about. Like he's used this flowery sort of language, these big terms and whatever. And I literally have no idea. Like I just would like to know what he's trying to say, but there's a way in which they want to use language to sort of really expand our minds, and that's my problem. Is I was trying to nail him down on something like what he actually believed. But there's this hilarious thing that happened where a analytic philosopher wrote an article about nothing. Like he just used all the buzzwords of postmodernism, sent it into a postmodern journal, and got it published. And that was the big sort of mockery that it was about nothing. So
then the question is, how do they explain that people's language changes depending on which group of people they're interacting?
Well, I think they might kind of like that idea, that it changes. I mean, in other words, I think the outlook is that, yeah, you even take a very narrow group, narrow in the sense that there's not as much diversity in beliefs, like say the Southern Baptists. We've got our quibbles, but we largely have similar views. Southern Baptists of today with the Southern Baptists of 50 years ago or something. And we might even have some of the same language, but the meanings have changed. And so their sort of situatedness, that's one of the buzzwords, is very different from the way in which we are. Well, it's at least, some difference, substantially different. But this is what's difficult is for us to really discover what that way was, or for me to really know what somebody, we might be able to sort of describe it if we were to go to, say, India or some tribe in Africa or South America someplace. There's a very different way of sort of seeing the world or whatever. We might be able to sort of describe it, but we're going to be always limited. It's always going to be sort of filtered through our own. So a lot of like sociology departments, anthropology departments, this is all the rage that we can kind of get in and sort of talk about them in some ways, but boy, for there to be any evaluation, for you to go into an anthropology department or sociology department and like evaluate the views of others and say they have this belief and it's a terrible one, you're not gonna last long. Okay. Philosophy departments, you're going to be great, but anthropology, not so much. Okay. Why think? I mean, as much as we can, I think we want to ask, what are the reasons to be a postmodern? I mean, we're going to criticize here in a minute, but I think a lot of people would say, look, we were just so very optimistic, and it was such a failure. The sort of Cartesian project was such a failure that it's put us in our place, and we realized we shouldn't have, the very assumptions we brought into that project were bad assumptions. So now sort of everything is, so the claim is everything is far more complex than we originally thought. And we can look at the various ways in which those sorts of optimistic beliefs got us into big trouble. They led after all to the world wars. And I mean, what did the modernistic period give us? When you look at again, when you read some of them, they act as if we're going to come to the end of, science. Scientists are going to be out of a job because we've got everything figured out. And we'll be living in this sort of utopian peace and so on. But the reality is we've had the biggest, most violent wars we've ever had, and we've had things like the Holocaust and so on. That's where modernistic thinking gets you. Right? Because if you think you've got the truth, Nazis or allies or whoever, you're going to take it to them in violence. Is the kind of idea. And I've heard people say pretty much that. If you think you know the truth, you'll take whatever means you need to get others to believe it. Okay.
Today, any movie, game, or anything you see, it's like if you're a group that says you have the truth, it's almost always done taken with violence. Anything. I mean, and you can look at that, and it's just like this ideology that's being preached or shuffled out there over and over and over and over.
Mm-hmm. Like, what would be an example? You said Hollywood, right? What would be an example where it's violence is?
Like in any movie where
okay.
That claims to have the truth, usually they promote that truth as violence and oppression of others.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, not. I guess my own view would be to say it doesn't have to lead to violence, right? And that's often the claim that seems to be made, is to say, look, if you think something is true and your neighboring country thinks it's false, well, get ready for war, right? But that just doesn't seem to have to follow, at least. Though, of course, wars have always been about some sort of disagreement or other, sometimes trivial, but unfortunately, but right, World War II, for example, was definitely a war about worldviews. There were different and competing views about how society should be ordered and so on. There was disagreements, though I don't think it has to, of course, always lead to violence and that sort of thing. But okay, and again, there are some arguments, right? If you read Nietzsche and some of these, there are arguments that they make to attempt to show there are these deep biases, these deep sort of worldview pictures through which we sort of see the world and so on. That colors the world. And sometimes those worldviews are so sort of deeply entrenched that it's hard to figure out if, it's hard to almost even see that we're making a judgment about something. Right? So again, take somebody who's like really given to racism, some sort of racist belief. They might say, hey, see that person? It's just obvious that they are of less quality, less value than me. Right? And you might say, oh, what's your argument? And I say, what argument? It's just obvious. Right? Well, that's a worldview lens. That's a kind of bias that they have. Now here's the postmodern move, is to say that's what all of our beliefs are. That's all of our ways of seeing the world have sort of filtered through that kind of a thing. And we can't really, There's nothing that we can appeal to that would judge whether or not that's a good way to see the world. Right? There are just ways of seeing the world, and that's it. End of story. All right, so let's move to some critique here. What I want to say is that postmodernism is right only about this fact, at least. So don't just read the first 3 words here. Postmodernism is right that we are limited and finite. I'm good with that. Like, I think that there has been a number of lessons in the history of, philosophy and thought that has shown that we were overly optimistic about some things. We weren't on the precipice of figuring science out. In fact, if we know anything these days, it's to know that there's so very little we do know scientifically about the world. There's so much more room for discovery, and we're likely wrong about much of what we believe, and we're going to revise it and so on. I don't know anybody that thinks we are substantially, down the path of figuring out the world. I don't know anybody think that. So that's definitely too great of optimism. My claim is to say that if we were kind of, optimistic on one hand, overly optimistic, and postmodernism is a correction to that optimism, it's a radical overcorrection. To give up truth itself, to say, yeah, we're not going to necessarily figure everything out, or we should be more humble about this, to say, and therefore we give up truth itself and it's only perspectival. There are no meta-narratives that can sort of judge or critique our biases and worldviews and micronarratives, what we might call micronarratives. I think we can be much more modest, and oftentimes we should be much more modest. Right, I even think theologically we need to just be careful to be modest. And modest in the sense that, yeah, we have our beliefs, but let's be careful to say what is like, I will give my life for this belief. I think this is true, and I will literally die for it. And other beliefs that we can say, this is some kind of 80-20 on this one, or maybe 70-30. I could be wrong about it. Isn't that right? That we have some of our theological beliefs, even important ones, we could still be a little bit I'm still working this out a little bit. I believe it, but I'm open to, hearing other views on it or something. Certainly things like the age of the earth, I think, should be in that category, is my own view. By the way, you might notice we're in week 4 and I have not mentioned the age of the earth, I don't think at least. That's in part because I think it is a fairly minor, of minor importance. I'm not saying it's not important, and people should think about it and have their different views and so on. I'm myself agnostic on that issue. I have no idea how old the Earth is or how old the universe is, honestly, and that's genuinely my view. I hear the arguments for a young Earth, and I think they're pretty good. I hear the arguments for the old Earth. I think they're kind of good. So I'm kind of in the middle where I just say, is it change all the rest of my views? No, not really. I'm actually pretty comfortable, like, living right in the middle there in the tension of it all. Now, that's not to say, just to be careful, that therefore evolution's, or anything like that. Nothing. It's not to concede anything. Again, if I was pushed, I'd probably be young Earth. If I had to sort of come down on one side or the other, I'd probably say young Earth. But ask me in 10 minutes, I might say old Earth. That kind of thing. I really think that there's really good arguments on both sides. And there's good folks on both sides. And we let that issue divide us so very much. I think that's really, really unfortunate that it does. Right? I do believe there is an Earth. I do believe that Genesis 1 and 2 say all true things. It's just a debate about the genre of Genesis 1 and 2, whether or not it is meant to be taken as history, sort of literal history, or it's doing a more still saying all truths, but doing something that's not meant to be taken strictly as the first day this happened, first 24-hour day, that sort of thing. And that's a debate we should have. And I think we should be modest about that, right? I think we should be humble about that to say, well, here's my arguments, and we might be on one side of the issue, we are fully on that side of that issue, but not disassociate with those and call them half Christians if they don't, which I've heard people in this debate call others half Christians if they hold to a contrary view. Again, I think there are views like inerrancy and the deity of Christ. I mean, these are views that are very, very, very important, and they're not like 70-30 or anything, right? But there are other theological views. It's like, I've got my views, but let's just let's have the dialogue. Let's talk about it. Let's we might just agree to disagree and so on, but just the point is being modest about that. And I wish, honestly, that people were more modest in discussions about science outside of the church, right? About Darwinian evolution and these sorts of things. I wish there was a bit more of like, let's really look at the evidence and see what we're forced to say by the evidence. And I really think Darwinian evolution should be one of those very open questions in the broader scientific community, but it's not. It's a kind of dogma. So I think we can have modesty without having to go to the extreme of saying truth is perspectival. Okay. Again, today, I don't know anybody that requires certainty, no philosopher that requires certainty in Descartes' sense, sometimes called Cartesian certainty or mathematical certainty. They're not forced then, therefore, into postmodernism. That's the point. The claim would be we can have lots of knowledge of the world. In fact, we can even evaluate our views, and I can evaluate your views, and you can evaluate my views. Right? How do we do that? Well, we do that by figuring out which of our views correspond to the way the world is. Let's just dip a little bit here into the correspondence theory of truth. I think I've mentioned this and maybe drawn some pictures, but here you go. So we've talked statements, right? What I want you to see with the correspondence theory of truth is there's two things in view here. One is, on one hand, of statements. We've talked about that in logic. Those things that are either true or false, sometimes called propositions. These are called the truth bearers. They are the things that are either true or false. And on the other hand, you have, when they're true statements, there are the facts of the world. If I have the belief that God exists, that's the statement, that's the proposition, that's what I believe. That's either true or false. When is it true? It's true insofar as God in fact exists. Or if I have the belief that the Rangers are going to go all the way this year. Anybody have that belief? Okay. Just checking. That's true insofar as that corresponds to the way the world is, which of course is a future sort of thing. But in any case, it's the facts of the world that we call truth makers. They make our beliefs true or false. Well, they make our beliefs true. If they don't exist, then the statements are false. If there's nothing to which the statement corresponds, then they're false. So here's a statement. I'm not endorsing the statement. I'm saying this is a statement people make, right? Global warming exists. Is that true? Well, that's true insofar as there's a fact, notice that makes, which way is that point? Makes that statement true. Right? Or again, that we call the truth relation. Right? So again, this is the picture I might have drawn. So the person, they believe, let's say, that's a belief bubble there. They believe that there's a tree in front of them. Is that true? Well, that's true insofar as there's, in fact, a tree in front of them. So there's a fact. This is the fact. There's a belief, which is a way to express a statement or proposition. This we call the truth bearer. This we call the truth maker. This we call the truth relation. Oops. relation, and it is the relation of correspondence. Or think of it as the matching relation, or it fits. So our statements are true when they correspond to the way the world is.
Only a truth relation if the correspondence equals true, or does they say false truth relation?
So if there is no fact out here, there is no relation. Relations require two things to exist. In other words, if you don't have a brother, and you don't stand in that brother relation, there is no relation. So we would say, if this was absent, we would just say that's a false belief because there's nothing to which it corresponds. It doesn't match anything in the world. Right? Or if we were to say, there's a tree outside my window, right? I see a few, actually. Is that true? Well, it depends. Does it correspond in the way the world is? If I were to say unicorns exist, or if I were to say there's a pink elephant in the room, like a big one, 2-ton pink elephant, it's false. Or take this, if I were to say there is a Ford F-150, year 1999, I think it does that, red in the parking lot, is that true? I don't know. I mean, I just made it, if that wasn't obvious, I just made that up. It is true insofar as there is one, and it's false otherwise. And I don't even know if it's true or false, right? I've made a statement. Is it true? Well, it's true if it corresponds to the way the world is. Unicorn, I put a question mark there, but we know. Yeah, okay. That's just to hedge my bet, be a little modest, right? Okay, here's another sort of example. That's my wife and I and our 2 kids at the time. We have 4 now, but that is actually a painting. It's a painting that my mom painted. She's a professional painter. Here's the picture from which she painted. Now, this is just an analogy. So this is meant to be the picture, the photograph is the way the world is, so to speak. That's the fact. Whereas the picture is meant to match that. And so when we make claims about the world, insofar as our claims match the way the world is, then those are true claims and they're false otherwise. All right, so I'm trying to illustrate the correspondence relation. She's particularly good. So if you need any portrait artists. She actually did the governor of Colorado's official portrait. They live in Colorado now, but yeah, she often gets asked, sort of slim down the person from the photograph. Can you just give me a little nicer build? So again, the same illustration. That makes sense. So is that a good painting? Well, it is. I think it is, and from your reactions, I think you think it is. Why? Because it matches reality. Are our statements good ones? Well, they are. We're going to call that truth insofar as they match the way the world is. Okay.
Yeah, you can still see what she wanted to make a point of more than this.
Yeah. Yeah. And my wife is suddenly wearing a dress instead of jeans. And daughter, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Doesn't quite match.
Yes, he stated
okay. So that's all. No, notice this would be explicitly denied. The correspondence theory of truth would be denied by a postmodern person, because they're making truth turn on our perspective, so that your perspective could be very different from my perspective. But I want to say, just what we mean by truth is, does our perspective, do our beliefs match reality? And they're false if they don't. That's why the bridge collapses when we try to do something fancy and with some flair and artistic sort of stuff to it, right? And it works, it holds us up, and we get to the moon and we get to our destination on the airplane and so on when those sorts of things are made properly. Right? They match the way reality is. They are truth. Okay, let me skip. Sorry. So let's do a little critique here. Now, one thing to say is we do have, I think, Cartesian certainty about some things like the laws of logic. That's why I say, if your view, it's sort of like your view or the laws of logic, it's too bad for your view there. It's going to lose. Right? But we do have certainty. I don't think you can coherently doubt the law of non-contradiction. Why? Because you're going to have to contradict it. Right? You're going to have to use it in order to deny it. And when you use it, you affirm it in denying it. So try that out. See how that works out for you. I also think, and this gets into my epistemological view that we can talk about later if you want to, but I think we can similarly discern when our beliefs are probably true. And notice probably true allows for them to possibly be false. So when I see that there's a tree out the window, I think I'm not only sort of like given to my perspective, I think given my awareness of reality, notice I can be aware of its likelihood of being true, or it's being probably true. Which is, catch the modest. I mean, I'm not, anyway, brag or anything, but it's a modest sort of claim. It's saying, I think that's probably right. I think that's a pretty rational view. I think if I tried to walk through that or drive through that, I'd be in trouble. I think it's probably true, right? Because I'm aware of certain facts, I want to say, including the ability to know what's probably true or at least very reasonable to believe. And again, I haven't given you much, but I'm just saying that would be my own view. So long as we have this groundwork of logic that we spent last week on, and we have that sort of awareness, then we can judge whether something is rational. We can discern evidence that points to truth. All right, we're out of time here. I just got a couple slides left. What I'll probably, I think, just do is pick this up next time. We'll just pick up around these last couple slides. It's going to take me a bit. I got just a bit more to do on this, and I think it's going to take us too far over to try to. So let's pick it up there next time, and then. But yeah, have a good.